My name is Angus Kennedy. I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's keynote session, State versus Market. Is there a way forward? It's a discussion put together by the Institute of Ideas Economy Forum. And what we're going to discuss is broadly what's in the title, the state versus market, but with a bit of a twist, because sometimes it's discussed in a very black and white or caricatured way, as in state good, market bad, or vice versa, market good, state bad, and battle lines can be formed, and there's a lot of heat, but sometimes not very much light in the discussion. So I don't think my panel split down the middle in that simple way. I think we're going to try and explore the way in which state and market relate to today, what's different today than some of the old ideological battles between the two, and see what comes out of that discussion. I don't know where it will lead us. I've been organizing battle satellites in Europe and been away the last 6 days. I took some reading as preparation with me. I found an Institute of Economic Affairs pamphlet in the Institute of Ideas office, and its title was The Road Ahead, Government or Market. And I thought, brilliant, this will help me get some clarity on it. So I started reading it in Amsterdam on Saturday night, and I found out it was really about roads ahead, i.e. should they be privatized or not. So I've been left really none the wiser but I do know quite a lot about the benefits and drawbacks of toll systems on public motorways. So if the discussion goes in that way, I'm the expert. You probably know what the format is here. We're going to have brief introductions from the panel of 5 to 7 minutes each, and I'll introduce them to you now in the order they're going to speak. First, on my left here is Thomas Hyland Eriksson. He's a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo, which sounds good, but he's also a novelist, which is good, and an author of some important books in this area, Ethnicity and Nationalism, and also Globalization, the Key Concepts. Then on my right, Louise Cooper will speak. She's a financial and economic commentator. Used to be a stockbroker at Goldman Sachs. Please don't hold that against her, because she's paid for that with a lot of time on the BBC World Service, doing her penance, but now runs her own consultancy, blogging business, Cooper City, and is very much in the media today, from Newsnight to Alan Titchmarsh and all points in between. Third to speak is, on my far right, Phil Mullen, who's an economist, the business transformation director at EasyNet Global Services, and a writer on economics, wrote a good book, The Imaginary Time Bomb, on the economics of aging, and is working on a new book at the moment, The Limits of Muddling Along, Why Trying to Save the Economy is Destroying Our Future, which is a great title and will be a good book. And finally, but last but not least, Andrew Sentence, on my far left, is a senior economic advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee and is also a part-time professor at Warwick Business School. So we give our panel a round of applause. And Thomas, will you get us going?
And thanks for the invitation. And as you realize from Angus's introduction, I mean, in a sense, I'm the odd man out, because I'm not an economist and I'm not even British, okay? So I'm a foreign non-economist. I'm not sure to what extent my comments will be relevant, but I'm going to do my best. Now, in a certain sense, the opposition between state and market is false. I mean, the question is wrongly asked. And we certainly see that in today's world, because there are so many entanglements, right, between, as it were, the state, which represents a certain kind of logic and a certain way of organizing things, and the market, which represents another one. So I think maybe one way of framing the debate could be to talk about two opposing, or rather complementary, perhaps, and sometimes conflicting moral principles. That of utility, often translated into profit on the one hand, and that of sociality on the other, which all economical systems contain, because economics or economies are always moral, of course. I mean, all economy has a moral dimension. Adam Smith was first and foremost known in his day as a moral philosopher. So when he spoke about the enlightened self-interest, for example, it was very much about the moral improvement of humanity. He tried to make people more independent of all sorts of impediments and constraints on their individuality. there has been a change in the relationship between state and market, which we perceive, I mean, in many places in the world, and not least in Scandinavia, where I live, which is often perceived from the outside as a place where the state is very strong and the market just has sort of to follow the dictates of the state. When I started to teach nationalism in the sense of national cohesion, nation building, national integration, state building, that sort of thing, 19th century and early 20th century topics. In the past, I mean, I've been teaching courses on nationalism for 25 years, okay, and in the beginning, I would say things such as having railways, for example, is an important aspect of nation building, and it has been in the West because it creates national cohesion and it sort of accustoms people to thinking about themselves as citizens. Similarly with postal services, it's a public service. It's not meant to make a profit because it's something you have as a citizen, not as a customer. And then on with the electricity grid and a number of other examples. I had to change that a little bit because towards the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, it was quite clear that even in a country like Norway, well, the postal service was apparently something you had as long as it made a profit. You know, as long as you were a profitable customer, you had a postal service. So many of our post offices have been closed down with various good and bad consequences. It's being discussed whether it's a good or a bad thing, but it has happened because they don't make a profit. So taken to its extreme, you might say that the postal service will finally not be in the red anymore. They'll be in the black. You know, they'll make a profit finally when they have no more customers and no more, you know, parcels and letters to distribute, and that day may come before we know it. So that's you know one of the dimensions that we need to talk about, and it also reveals the necessary entanglement between state and market in contemporary societies because one can't do without the other. Now, but let me give you a few more examples, and an example which came to me just a day or two ago is this. A friend of mine, she's Norwegian. They live in a Latin American country. She had been experiencing some pain, okay? So she went to see a doctor. Now, they are well insured, okay? And the hospital that she was admitted to eventually was private, of course. She got surgery after one day, okay? And has now recovered. It happened like this, you know? We hardly heard about her illness before it was over. Good thing, you know, private hospital, insurance, free choice. But had she lived in Norway, which has a public health service, which is, you know, considered reasonably good, but of course lots of complaints about it, she would have gotten exactly the same treatment for free, but she might have had to wait for 3 weeks or 2 months. Nobody knows. So, in other words, for her, good thing that the hospitals in this Latin American country were private, but probably not as good news for many of the other citizens, as it were, people living in that country. So that's I mean, another dimension of state versus market is to what extent are we prepared to deal with increased inequality? I mean, the UK, since the 1980s, I think it could be a good example. We could find a lot of examples from the UK which illustrate this point as well. And there has been a tendency, it seems to me, during these last, say, 30 years or so, to redefine the citizen from being, as it were, a citizen with certain rights and obligations towards a society to a customer. Has that happened? I mean, that's one question we could ask. Have we increasingly become customers? Is it, as it were, the case that, say, where I teach at university, our students used to consider themselves students, and now they consider themselves customers who are entitled to a certain commodity, which is knowledge. And they complain if they don't get that commodity because they've paid for it. Well, they haven't really paid for it, but maybe their parents have paid for it through paying taxes, okay? Because education is free in Norway. But you see the point. Have we become customers rather than citizens? And what does that entail? I think that what we need to do is in order to have a society, it's quite clear that the market principle is fine for certain kind of economic transactions and lots of things that go on in the economy, but it's not sufficient to run a society. You need to have trust, you need to have sociality, you need to have what we in anthropology call reciprocity, you know, these sort of fuzzy mutual obligations that you develop simply through living in a society. And here we need to be aware that in a complex society, it is not enough to have a who to trust. You also need to have a what to trust. So, in other words, is it just a who that we trust, as in certain traditional society and in certain failed states? You know, people don't really trust institutions. Or is there a what? You cannot trust corporations because their ultimate aim is only to make profits. So you can't really trust them in the long run. You have to have something else, something abstract, okay? That makes you identify with whichever imagined community you feel like you live in, whether that's a nation state or not. I'm not going into that issue now. But you need to have a what to trust. And finally, we need to rethink in this context the concept of value, which is an incredibly important concept, the concept of value, because it both has, just as in Adam Smith's work and in subsequent economic work, it has an economic dimension but also a moral dimension. What kind of value are we looking for? There may be an intrinsic value in knowing that you're not going to be evicted from your house, which happened to lots of people back home in the late 1980s, when we also had been infected with the sort of the virus that came from the UK and the US, so that the housing market was deregulated, and lots of people discovered that they could no longer afford to live in the flats where they had lived all their lives because they had to buy them. Okay, which was presented as a form of freedom. Is that the kind of freedom that you want? I guess the bottom line for now, from me, and I'll just throw this into the debate, is that if we can live with increased inequality, then deregulate as much as you can, and if you can't, you need to sort of push towards the other set of values. And this is not necessarily just state market, because the state now increasingly, through new public management, behaves as though it were a private corporation. You know, hospitals expected to make a profit, and so on and so forth. Universities expected to make a profit, which in my world, you know, is a strange way of thinking about hospitals and universities, but it's become the order of the day. Yeah, there are other things I could say, but I guess I'll have the opportunity later on.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. That's a really good overview of some of the issues and bringing in the question of freedom and security as well as they relate to that state market tension. Louise?
I thought I'd set out my stall. I am a capitalist. I firmly believe that the best outcomes come from fierce competition. I think the best outcome comes from the ability of true innovators, true entrepreneurs, and true risk takers to benefit financially from their efforts. You know, iPad, you know, whatever you think of them, but all the Apple products wouldn't have been created in a communist state. And it is right that those who created them keep the wealth of that. However, I also think, by the way, that the state does not manage businesses as efficiently as the private sector. And I don't know why, but I firmly believe that, having worked both at the BBC, state organisation effectively, and in the private sector, completely different ways of managing. Having said that, the problem is it's not black and white. There are many areas in an economy where, for various reasons, you know, competition is very, very difficult to put there. So clearly you have natural monopolies. So, you know, British Telecom used to have a natural monopoly. In many ways, it still does, because it has the copper wires in the ground. You know, the electricity distribution network in this country, it's a natural monopoly. There's also areas that are almost, I think, too important to be left to the state. So, and here I would say education. I'm a fierce believer in state education. And to me, education, for example, isn't just another industry. It's much more integral to this country's, to society, to the way we all work together, and it's the core resource of our futures. You know, the human resources, any top CEO will tell you, people are the most important asset that they have in a business. So to me, I look at education, I think, well, that's natural for the state to manage. But then part of me thinks, yes, but so many politicians do it badly. Maybe we should have the state paying for it and bringing in external providers. Now, I don't know. I think given the mess that's been created at Derbyshire Free School, Michael Gove's policies of free school, the Muslim school that's been so much in the papers this week and slammed by Ofsted, clearly he's trying to do something like that and it's not working. And then I look at the health industry, and I have great problems with the health industry not being anything other than state-controlled. So the pharmaceutical industry in particular is, I don't think we should leave drug discovery to the pharmaceutical industry. Because if we leave drug discovery to the pharmaceutical industry, the only drugs they will discover is the blockbuster drugs. So if you get a rare illness, do never expect the pharmaceutical industry to look after you. So for example, both my children have been quite seriously ill. One of them had a very rare cancer. No money in it. Only 60 children a year in the UK get it. The drug industry will never bother doing research into this area. And then my son had a heart condition, which only 1 or 2 children a year get in the UK. Again, forget the drug industry ever looking after these orphan illnesses. And that is a big issue. If you leave drug discovery just to the drug industry, where profit maximizing is their only concern, orphan illnesses get left behind. It's also the case that, I don't know if most people don't realize, is that pediatric medicines mostly aren't licensed for children's use, because drug companies will never go to the bother and the expense of testing their drugs on children. So all childhood drugs that they get in hospitals are unlicensed for children, untested in children. And that's all to do with the profit-maximizing motive. So clearly, there are areas where the state has to step in. And I think the difficulty is knowing where you do that line. So a friend of mine is now running the first NHS hospital as a private company. You may have read about it, Circle Partnership. So far, and they've been running it for a few years, the results are pretty mixed. At the moment, I'm pretty sure they can't prove that they run it much more efficiently than the state. Now, that's just an experiment, and it's just starting. So I wait to see how that goes on. And then another industry, again, another very big problem in this country, the price of housing. 50 years ago, the state built houses. It doesn't anymore. Effectively, it doesn't. We are leaving the supply of housing to 6, 7 housing companies. Now, at the moment, we have a massive problem with supply in this country. We've got massive demand and not enough supply, which is the reason why price is going up. Classic economics. Again, I wonder, and I don't know what the answer is, but I wonder if we should be leaving something as fundamental to this country as the quality of our housing stock just to profit-maximizing companies. Because clearly, if you were profit-maximizing, you would sit on your land bank forever and build small amounts of houses at a time and wait for the price of the house to go up. And I don't know the answer. And I think this is where it gets really interesting, is where you draw the line. Do you privatize absolutely everything or nothing? And, you know, and again, you know, this is 10 days ago, Royal Mail was privatized, and Thatcher famously said she would never sell off the Queen's face. The problem is that these industries that we benefit from, and in classic case would be the Royal Mail, there's a small amount of people, i.e. the workers at the Royal Mail, who benefit enormously from a taxpayer subsidy. But the rest of us don't really realise we're subsidising a very big loss-making industry. And therefore, the lobbying effort is a small amount of people who get massive gains from a loss-making, tax-subsidised, taxpayer-subsidised industry, versus lots of us who don't really realise we're paying for it. Because the Royal Mail has made losses and losses for years and years and years. So much so that it's sort of tax carry-on will be, they won't pay tax for another 6 years. And then I've got thoughts about regulation. I always think, so clearly if you think that the capitalist system fails, you go for regulators. And I've got lots of opinions on regulators that boil down to they're a bit rubbish, really. And I talked about this on Question Time. I was on Question Time recently. The problem with regulators is they get way too close to the industries that they regulate. And what happens is the regulators bounce between the regulator and the industry, and they move their jobs from one to the other. Therefore, they all know each other. It's a very small group of experts, and they, rather than putting the rest of us at the core of what they do to compensate for the failure of the capitalist market, is actually they get too close to the companies and they look after the companies too much. And that always, always happens. And interestingly, when I was talking about this, about the energy industry, a regulator of the energy industry actually emailed me and said, I couldn't agree with you more. In the end, I got out of it because I was so disgusted at how close the energy regulator had got to the energy industry. So I think there's no easy answer. I think it's a very, very difficult question. And I think where we draw the line is exactly, you know, we have these discussions like this and we work out as a society where we think the line should be drawn.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Louise. I mean, that's something we'll definitely come back to in terms of the question of regulation, how much and who decides. Phil, your thoughts?
Okay. Well, I agree with Louise. It's a difficult question, but I'd like to spend my few minutes dealing with some of sort of the, I think some of the basics, or to get some of the confusions and distortions out of the way to open up the discussion. Because I think it's long overdue that we put to the sword the two main conventional narratives about the state and the market that linger on from the last century, because I think those two narratives too much influence and distort the contemporary discussion. The first narrative, associated broadly with the old right, would see the market as a sort of caged lion, suppressed and restrained by the bars of an onerous state. And that if only the lion could break free, could get away from that shackles of state regulation, taxation, other distortions arising from intervention, then the lion, the market, could bind free and overcome all our economic problems. That's the right's view. The left's view, the old left, might also compare the market to a lion, but a rather less majestic lion. I'd say like a circus lion, a bit greedy, a bit of a fat cat, but still potentially very dangerous. And it's a lion, a circus lion, that sometimes gets a bit lethargic and seems to seize up. So it needs its trainer, the state, to prod it every so often and try to reignite some animal spirits, to quote Keynes, and get it moving again. Whereas the rest of the time, the view is that the lion needs the trainer to have a firm hand upon it, to regulate it, to control it, and to thereby prevent it becoming anarchic and unruly. And under that narrative, the old left narrative, today's economic and financial problems derive from a rather ineffective trainer. The state has withdrawn too much, and this has given the lion far too much free play, far too much freedom, which has caused the havoc which we're living through today. Now, I think those two old narratives, the common problem with them is the way that they present a dichotomy between the state and the market, an opposition between them as separate and autonomous from each other. Now, in contrast, I'm going to suggest a different narrative, and I'll also give a bit of a twist in the tale, which I think begins to explain why we are in today's economic malaise. My narrative is of a much more symbiotic, joined together and interdependent relationship, that entanglement which Thomas has talked about, but more deep and systemic than I think is often seen. While it is the market that ultimately creates the value and the resources for the state to operate and do all it does, the state plays the dominant directing role in the relationship, acting to support the interests of the market in general. Now, if I shift the analogy from the animal kingdom to the human world, the market-state relationship of dependency is more like the condition of a human's dependency over its lifetime. Very dependent in its early infant years, achieving a level of independence during adulthood, but as it moves into maturity and into old age, becomes increasingly more dependent again. And I think the history of market capitalism parallels this cycle of the rise and the fall and the rise again of dependency upon the state. With the difference to the human life cycle that, in fact, the period of adult-like independence from the state, the reputed laissez-faire free market period, is actually a very, very short one, even if it actually existed in full, to a full extent at all. Taking Britain as the exemplar of this narrative, we've seen in the early days the state playing a very interventionist role, clearing away the fetters of feudalism and then retreating a bit, and then from the end of the 19th century increasingly intervening again to support a decaying and relatively declining British capitalism. So that every major crisis point in the 20th century, if we just use the measure of state spending in the economy, every crisis point we see a ratcheting up of the state's role economically in the economy. The First World War, the slump in the 1930s, then the Second World War, and again up to about 40% of GDP when we get to the renewed slowdown in the 1970s. And contrary, and I really stress this point, contrary to the still common idea that there was some sort of neoliberal market revival initiated by Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, I would argue that that relationship of market dependence has continued to expand steadily ever since. And a potentially and particularly important form of it, which perhaps we can discuss a bit more in the discussion, since the late 80s, has been state financialization. The way the state and its central banks have pushed easy money policies to keep credit and the economy moving. So my alternative narrative to the old two from the last century is of ever deeper and closer state-market intertwining over the past century. Now, the twist in the tail in my narrative, I think, follows on from this increasingly financialized form of state economic intervention, which I think contrasts to the earlier forms when the state's role was more focused on supporting the industrial part of the economy. In earlier times, I'd argue, that's before the 1980s, the state's industrial economic intervention could be either positive or negative for growth and for progress, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But in its more recent financialized form over the last 20, 25 years, I'd argue that the impact of the state has been overwhelmingly negative. A way to view this shift, this contrast, is that I think the state historically has sought to balance two economic roles. The first role it tries to follow is to maintain existing businesses, and with them the existing jobs and maintaining living standards for people who work in those businesses. And thereby, you could say, limiting economic instability, just trying to maintain the status quo. The second role historically for the state has been assisting the market to get through its economic problems, helping to restructure the economy to bring about the basis for future growth and prosperity. Now, these two roles, what I could call the stability role and the renewal role, have always been contradictory, because creating the conditions for longer-term growth requires some level of the reorganization of economic life, which is always disruptive. So it always counters the stabilization perspective. Some call this Schumpeterian creative destruction. Others would call it the cleansing role of the recession, as older and weaker businesses go under and clearing the way for resources to flow to the leaner, more profitable, more technologically advanced parts of the economy. My argument is that up to the early 1980s, whenever economic life could not go on in the old way, the state would step in to facilitate bouts of economic restructuring. Broadly speaking, renewal would trump stability. Now I think the balance has shifted, and shifted almost completely to the other side, where stability above all else seems to be the guiding principle in states in the Western economies. I think, just to give one example, as I know I'm running close on time, but the coalition government's Help to Buy scheme that there's been so much discussion about, I think is a classic instance of that stabilization approach, even when it's pointed out that this is going to create problems down the line. The instinct is a short-term pragmatism, which is often channeled through credit, often channeled through boosting consumption. And I think, as I say, that has one-sidedly taken over the state's role in comparison to the earlier tradition, at a time when decisions, painful decisions and tough decisions would be made by the state in order to help the market restructure and see society through those times. Instead, the state seems to, I would argue, have abandoned any real aspiration for pushing productivity and for trying to bring about durable growth in production. And the harmful effect of this shift is the entrenchment of atrophy pretty much all around the Western world, and what some, I think, correctly call the creation of a zombie-type economy. And to conclude, because we all know that when stability gets promoted, as it is in the last 20 years or so, as the number one priority, then instability is never far away. If you are not taking control of change, if a state is not trying to change things for the better in a changing world, then change will happen anyway. And you will get disrupted, and the crisis will return, as we see all too well in the unprecedentedly weak recoveries everywhere across the Western world at this stage.
Brilliant. Thank you, Phil, for twisting the tails of zombie lions. It's dangerous business. Andrew.
When you, Angus, said you got this book, The Road Ahead, Government versus Market, and you took it away and you discovered something about it, I thought you were going to say it was written in the 1970s. Because I remember when I was started studying economics in the 1970s, probably show my age here, there was a lot of debate about state versus market as a sort of theme coming out of the period in the 50s and the 60s, when I think government activity became more significant in many economies, particularly the Western economies. And to some extent, that debate seemed to be answered in the 80s and the 90s, because the sort of dominant state-based economy, the Soviet Union, which is based around state planning and its satellite economies, really founded in the 1980s, and the economies of the Soviet Union formally broke up. And then in the 1990s, the large economies of the world that were trying to develop and emerge, such as China and India, they looked predominantly for a market-based model to try and do that. In many respects, China and India still, government plays a large role in those economies, particularly in China. But the change from where they were to what's made them enable their economies to grow and become more successful has been to try and allow market forces to have more reign. And so while and similar things you could be said about the Western economies, that while the market-based system seems to sort of dominate after that period in the 70s, we still have relatively high levels of government spending and relatively high tax takes across the major Western economies. Most OECD economies, most of the advanced economies, government spends between 40 or 50% of GDP, and in some Scandinavian economies, France, government spends more than 50% of GDP. And even the ones where government spends less, such as the United States or Korea, are still spending over 30% of GDP. So what we really have is, yes, I think there's an understanding that for an economy to be successful, a market economy has to be at the heart of it. But we still have large degrees of government activity and intervention in all the economies, all the major economies around the world, which takes us to the question of, where should the balance lie, and what should we expect government to do, and what should we expect the market to do? So in the just 2 or 3 minutes remaining, let me try and answer those questions. I think in terms of where should the balance lie, I think starting where we are now in the major Western economies, I can't speak for China and the developing and emerging world, I think there is probably a need to try and shift the balance back a bit, away from government interventions and to let the market operate a bit more freely. And I say that for 3 main reasons. One is, around the Western world, governments are struggling to finance the things that they already do. In other words, many governments, including our own, including the United States, which has been illustrated recently, have large deficits, and their debt to GDP ratios are rising and are very significantly higher than they were some time ago. And though some people say, the solution to that is to raise taxes, if you look in the case of the UK, many of our tax rates are much higher than we've seen historically for some time. For example, we now have a 20% VAT rate. It used to be, before the 1990s, it used to be 15%, then it went up to 17.5%. We have top rates of tax, just gone down from 50 to 45%, but from the late 80s onwards, it was just 40%. And many people are finding themselves paying a 40% income tax rate if they're more than sort of 1.5 times above average earnings in the UK. So I don't see the solution as trying to sort of squeeze the tax payer much harder. I think we do need to shift backwards towards the balance between government and the market, and try and find ways of allowing the market to operate more freely. The second reason I say that is because I think in the financial crisis, and this has already been alluded to, there was a natural reaction from government to intervene and to do things in the economy to stabilize the economy and to stop things getting worse and to try and deal with the problems that the financial crisis was throwing up. Now that's quite the right reaction in an emergency situation. But we don't keep emergency policies in place indefinitely. The sort of policies that we put in place in the Second World War in terms of rationing, emergency powers of government, those had to be eased off after the war in order to let the market economy operate. And I think we face a similar challenge post the financial crisis. And the third reason I think we need to allow the market to operate is, like Louise, I basically believe that the engine of growth in the economy is private enterprise, the capitalist system, even though it has its faults, and the market-based economic activities. And we're in a period in the UK and other Western economies when a long period of growth has come to an end with the financial crisis. We're now in what I call a new normal of slow growth. And in order to break out of that slow growth period, the economy needs to restructure and adjust in various ways. And I don't have the confidence that the government can dictate what those adjustments need to be. The market needs to find the ways in which the economy can tap into sources of growth for the future, whether through new technology, new business models, servicing new markets in the emerging world. And so for all those three reasons, I think in the UK and other Western economies, there's a need, not dramatically, to shift the balance away from government interventions and government activity towards the market in the current situation. If that's the case, then what we should be looking for the government to do? If the government has to prioritise certain things and become more effective in what it does, how should it go about this? Well, I think this, to some extent, in Western economies, governments are giant legacy businesses. I used to work for British Airways, was often referred to as a legacy airline because it had developed its business under state control and then been privatised. And the new up-and-coming airlines on the low-cost model were challenging its business. Governments are massive legacy businesses that have accumulated activities over long periods of history, for most of the 20th century, and I think continually have to be in a process of trying to restructure and renew themselves. I think there's four main areas where we should look for what we should be looking for government to do in the current circumstances. One is to try and set the framework in key areas where government acts, but not to try and deliver the services necessarily itself, to set the framework for individuals and firms and other entities to operate. Secondly, there's certain strategic investments, and other speakers have alluded to them, where government does need to come in and actually make a strategic investment, whether it's in terms of transport infrastructure or the education system. I think those areas are relatively limited, but actually if government is less encumbered by delivering other sorts of activities, it can focus more strongly on those strategic investments. And the two other areas I would highlight are, first of all, becoming much more effective and efficient in the delivery of public services. In lots of areas of the private sector, technology and new ways of delivering services are coming forward. The public sector needs to recognise that as well. And finally, we do need, I think, to reform tax and benefit systems so they operate more effectively and efficiently in the current environment.
Can we thank our panel? Can I just kick around the question of regulation, or if you like, something you've all touched on, which is where do you draw the line? And maybe just pick up from your last point, Andrew. In Phil's terms, the metaphor of the caged lion, king of the wild, or the mangy circus lion, or the scary zombie lion, do you sit a bit more, it's the caged lion perspective and we should loosen some of the bars?
I think that's the analogy that's correct. I think changes as the historical circumstances of economies change. And I think we have moved into a position where we went through a long period of growth. Between 1982 and 2007 in the UK, average growth was over 3% per annum, which is very good by the standards of a mature economy like the UK. We only had one calendar year of negative growth in 1991. And people who grew up and developed their careers over that period, and politicians who were in power over that period, developed expectations that probably are now proving unrealistic. So we're in a position where expectations of what government could deliver that were formed in that period are probably excessive and need to be scaled down. And in that sense, probably we need to try and unleash the caged lion. In a world where growth seems to fall plentifully from the sky, it's very easy to put in place one regulation on top of another and to sort of gradually stifle the market. And it's only in difficult times, I think, that politicians are faced with the challenge of then trying to remove those and free up the market. And we saw this in the 70s and early 80s, and I think we need to go through a similar process now.
Louise, your thoughts?
I mean, I look back at the, so energy policy is a huge issue here in the UK at the moment. We've had British Gas and SSE, Southern Electricity, I think both increasing their energy prices in the UK in the last just few days, no matter what Ed Miliband says. And I think that's a classic example of, to me, what needs to be done. So Thatcher recognised that you need to introduce competition. So she split the UK power generation company into two, sold it off, and she split all the regional electricity companies. And I think there was about 12 created. I can't remember how many. It was a long, long time ago. Was it 12? And she split the 12 RECs into 12. And they suddenly could compete with each other. And we have benefited from the increasing efficiency and from reducing in costs. The trouble is, the industry is not stupid. So what the industry did is they realised to be more efficient, to have less competition, what the industry needed to do was to consolidate, so buy each other up. That reduces competition, it got benefits of scale, so cost economies and ability to take out costs. So now we originally had 14 companies, now we only have 6. And that, to me, is the regulator should be in there and fighting to create much more competition. You know, the UK banking industry is a classic example. In the crisis, Lloyds was allowed to buy HBOS, which has given it massive dominance of the UK retail market. Now, the European Commission has come in and said you've got to sell off some banks. But actually, in one way, I do agree with Vince Cable here, which is we need more competition. I think that the competition is a much better answer to regulation every single time. And I think the example after example shows that.
Where do you stand on this question of regulated competition or unregulated competition, Thomas?
Well, I don't have a problem with competition as such, because, I mean, I wrote a book with a biologist friend of mine last year on competition, where in fact, we point out that competition is a driving force of evolution. It's a motor, it's the engine of evolution. Had it not been for competition, we would still be at the level of the amoeba. So we should be grateful for the principle of competition. And this also holds true for cultural evolution. But the problem with competition, I mean, the issue with competition is that it has to be seen as a complementary force to cooperation. Okay, I spoke about utility versus sociality, and the less technical way of putting it is to say that we human beings, we compete, but we also collaborate, and sometimes we have to collaborate because there are some unintentional consequences of competition. For example, you can have healthy growth in an economy at the national level and increase inequality and poverty and misery. I mean, the US would be an excellent example of this. And there are also some other unintentional consequences. I mean, not just inequality in the sense that capitalism or competition, it produces winners, but it also produces losers, sometimes far more losers. Well, maybe that's a natural law, and we have to cope with it. But take one topic that we're probably not going to be able to take on in this panel, but let me just mention it. The fundamental contradiction of contemporary civilization, the way I see it, is the contradiction between growth and sustainability, okay? And it is highly unlikely that market forces alone will help us get out of that fix of the climate crisis. So we need to see this in a more, I think, in a more balanced way. That you have these complementary forces. You've got competition, which is the engine, the motor. But we human beings are different. You see, from that, you know, if you take the literal line and not just the cage line, okay, the metaphorical line, in that we can sit down and decide. Can I? 30 more seconds, okay? Why do the trees in the forest just outside my house in Oslo, why do they have to be 80 feet tall? Why can't they just be 20 feet tall? Well, the reason is that the trees next to them are 75 feet tall, okay? So in order to produce enough seeds to reproduce themselves, they have to really stretch as far as they can. And then you may ask, as the philosopher Daniel Dennett once did in a similar example, why can't those trees just get together and decide that as from next year, we're only going to be 4 meters tall, so that we can spend the remaining energy on doing something nice, you know, going on picnics, exchanging jokes, having sex. Well, trees are not capable of doing that, but the point is that human beings are. We can get together and decide that as from next year, we'll settle for 4 meters, and maybe that will save us from undermining the conditions of our own existence.
Phil, come back on that, if you will. But
4 metre tree.
4 metre trees.
Thomas posed a question that relates, I think, to what you were saying in your opening comments. That we've got a situation where the mangy or dead lion needs to be replaced with a better one to be given a real stimulus. And you seem to be implying that that should be done by the state rather than by a fresh lion. But this state that you're talking about seems to be completely wedded to a regulatory, you know, financialization process with all these unintended, you know, negative consequences. It's trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube all the time, and it's impossible.
Yeah, but my point is that to rely on the market to somehow, reinvent itself is, I think, an incredibly idealized view of what's going on. There doesn't exist this free market to be able to reignite itself. I mean, I made the point in my introduction that in the early stages of capitalism, the early stages of market economies, actually the state was in the forefront of actually bringing about the conditions in which market relations could occur. It wasn't the case that the market suddenly appeared gradually and spontaneously out of feudalism. The state intervened, hothouse fashion, brutally, to clear people off the feudal estates, to create a proletariat for industrial capitalism, to impose wage laws, to impose laws on working time, and so on. The state was the important catalyst for creating the conditions for capitalism. Now, I'm not arguing to go back to 18th century capitalism. What I am saying is that the discussion about a balance and getting the balance more in one way or the other, I think hugely misses the key problem today, which is not that there is a bit of fuzziness between the two, but that the state and the market have become completely intertwined and are completely bad for each other. Now, you're right, Angus, to make the point, well, aren't you being a bit unrealistic to point to the state as perhaps being the catalyst for being able to do something different again, to being able to change the nature of this zombified economy? I'm a bit limited in my imagination. I can't see what other institution could do that. I don't support state regulation. I don't support the sort of things state are doing, as I've tried to make clear. I think the state is completely bad at the moment. But I don't see any other agency which exists which we could use in order to create and recreate the conditions, not for capitalism and free competition, but create conditions for economic progress and development.
Okay, there is lots and lots and lots to talk about, from trees having sex to Miliband's energy policy and other interesting topics as well. So I'll take a group of people, 4 or 5 hands at a time, and try and start there.
I want to quickly pull someone up. First quick point is the reason why there hasn't been any new creation of banks is 2 reasons. One, all the ones that failed got bailed out by everyone else's money. If you really want new banks to form, you bite the bullet and say bad businesses fail. Just because they've got a hell of a lot of money, it doesn't make it any better than, say, keeping mines open because they were bankrupt. It's exactly the same principle. The only difference is one was done by working class people and the other is unfortunately owned by people who've got a lot of money, so it's cowardice. I want to bring on to Louise's point. Is that correct?
Yep, I'm Louise, yep.
Sorry, just want to make sure that I'm not being incredibly rude.
I'm the only woman on the panel.
It doesn't make you Louise.
You were talking before about, and I want to link what was said by Thomas about reciprocity and the differences between the market and the state, maybe. You were saying that in certain areas, you know that you can't really have competition, and you didn't really know what the answer was to this. Well, I'd like to propose one. Going back to the past, which was said, it was a labour idea way before the welfare state. It was the idea of working class mutuals. So organisations which actually controlled the services themselves and delivered them themselves. In this country, we used to have a fine history of working class mutuals, but now we've also got fan-owned football clubs. A great example of where a business, it is a business, has to run at a profit, has to succeed in a marketplace, attract new customers, but also there's that shared value between everyone in works, and there's that mutual reciprocity.
Okay.
So I think that may be an answer, actually going back to mutuals and cooperative organisations, as opposed to it being done by the state.
Thank you. I agree very much with Phil, I think the last speaker, about the way that the state did traditionally intervene to support capitalism. I think the current intertwining, you've got to look at things like PFIs, and is it to some extent that the state is now supporting the private sector, but in ways that are perhaps less efficient, less open than other ways. And also the regulation issue. Much of it, traditionally the state was seen as something that was a more democratic alternative to the market because it could be democratically controlled, but much regulation is now coming in from the EU, isn't decided in a very democratic way, but through lobbying to the Commission with no elected representatives being involved. And then finally, just on the issue of the post office was brought up, the Royal Mail. That was in public hands for a very long time. I think there would be some public support for some limited renationalisation of things like post office and the railways. But in the post office, it was cut off, wasn't it, in small slices. So profitable parts were sold off, so it became unprofitable. Therefore, it had to be sold off because it was unprofitable. So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling thing.
People talk about the market as an object, whereas we are the market. We vote with our money every time we go to a shop, every time we decide, actually, listening to a lot of people talking about state versus market would be a good idea. We have voted to come here with our money and pay for it and give our eyeballs to the sponsors. We got told that by Thomas that only with the state is there reciprocity and trust. We can't trust a corporation because all it wants to do is make a profit. But when we go to, say, a baker, we trust that he'll be making bread, and we trust that when we eat it, we won't die. Reciprocally, we'll give him his money, and he's only doing it, as Adam Smith said, because he wants to make the money from us. So to say that there's almost an idea that capitalism is the only thing that is part of the market, but us voting with our money and our revealed preferences is what a market is.
It's utter nonsense that everything has to make a profit. You don't have to make a profit. What you need is to nationalise the utilities, particularly the energy market, you nationalise the railways, you subsidise these, you subsidise the people who use these, and you pay for it through the taxation system. And it's a thing called socialism, and it's the thing that you haven't mentioned at all in the debate so far, and it's because there's an ideological imperative now that says that socialism has become a dirty word.
Andrew, I don't disagree with you that it would be helpful to see a reduction in government activity, but there's a bit of a paradox here, isn't there, in that the places where you would expect government to be the driving force, places like the military, healthcare, collection of tax, redistribution of tax, those are all things that are being more and more done in the private sector, which seems a bit odd. Whereas there's lots of areas where government is, where I would argue it shouldn't be. So, for example, intervening in relationships between employees and employers to some extent in individual relationships. And, you know, it's okay for Louise to say that, you know, the utilities are owned privately and the banks are owned privately. But actually, in both of those industries, government intervention is far greater than it was when those industries were nationalised. You know, so those are not operating in a typical private sector way. Phil, I just wanted to push you a bit because it seems to me that you're not quite going far enough. In my area of work, which is in pensions, we're currently seeing a very efficient system where everybody is auto-enrolled into a state system of pensions, being replaced by a private sector system where everybody is going to be enrolled into entirely inefficient vehicles for pension provision. So inefficient that even Prince Charles has realised they're dysfunctional. So, you know, why would governments, why would the capitalist economy, if you want to call it that, be doing things that are actually more inefficient? And to me, the only answer to that is because it's doing it for profoundly political and ideological reasons. It's not just doing it because of the economy, it's doing it because it has a political point to make. And that's perhaps links back to the socialism point. I just wanted to just push very quickly on this idea about fan ownership being the answer to everything. I speak as a part owner of FC United. These organisations exist largely because they are funded by government, local government rather than the national government. But they wouldn't exist without that, and it's part of the revalidation of local government.
I mean, there's an important trend in that contribution, which is towards greater state intervention into all walks of private life, not just private companies, but people's private lives. There's that regulatory theme, and we should feel free to bring that in as well.
I'm really enjoying the menagerie of lions that we're supposed to choose from. This zombie lion and the mangy one and the virile one or whatever. Is it possible to kind of think that it's a bit of a combination of these various animals? Because it strikes me that although there's some kind of like, you know, nice murmurings coming from some of the panel about how it would be nice to have slightly less regulation, that we should deregulate, that we should, see what the market can do. It would be interesting to have a few specifics about, it'd be good to have some responses as to whether the state is currently actively obstructing the possibility of economic activity. Because there seems to be a sort of dominant theme that the market is so decrepit and zombified that the state doesn't have an actual active role in fact, impeding the possibility of economic activity. By which I mean, and it would be interesting to have a few specifics in terms of what you would look for as a wealth-generating free market. For example, it doesn't seem that there's a free market in building airports. It doesn't seem that there's a free market in building power stations, right? There's no free market in the release of land supply in this country. So although there's free markets for energy, free markets for air slots at airports, and free markets for buying and selling houses, in each of those markets, the state is actively obstructive through planning, through energy policy, all these infrastructure issues, which are things that, obviously there is a housing bubble made up of money that could be used to build houses rather than buy and sell them. And you could point to the same issue in these other various sectors. So I'd really like to hear a bit more specifics about, well, okay, right now, where does the state have to get out of the way of the possibility of economic activity?
Just coming to the idea of whether the state should do sort of education and health and stuff like that, the problem that we have in a kind of basically short-term democracy is that the lifespan of a politician, of a political career, once time they get into cabinet, is maybe 10 years if they're lucky. We've never had more than 3 consecutive parliaments with the same prime minister. Well, not in recent history anyway. And you get this problem that how do you make somebody accountable when they know in 15 years' time they're going to be doing something completely different? And how do you make the state act like a CEO in that way to make it actually kind of worth their while, because we can't incentivize them. Education is fundamentally, we find good education will result in somebody's having a better quality of life, but only in 30 years' time. How can you measure the effect of primary education law on like a 9-year-old when they're 14 by the beginning of the next sort of parliament?
Yeah. Okay, so look, we've got 7 impossible questions to answer in the next 5 minutes, which not even the Red Queen could manage before breakfast. But
I'll give it a go.
Not that you're a Red Queen, Louise. But do you want to start?
I agree with you completely. It's driven by the electoral cycle, but also, to be fair, one of the things I'm on air a lot with politicians, and one thing I'm constantly aghast at is the appallingly low level of financial literacy of our political class. They just haven't got a clue. Now, I've never been on air with George Osborne, so I don't know about the Chancellor. But in terms of most other politicians, they have no idea what their actions do. Right, so moving back to the top. First question. If you think letting a bank go bust was a good idea, then the absolute economic havoc that it would wreak on this country would be massive compared to what we've experienced. What is wrong is that the regulator didn't have this concept of living wills, because banks are not like widget makers. Banks occupy a very specific part in our national economy, and there are certain things that they do, deposit taking, cheque clearing, that kind of stuff, where you can't just suddenly stop it. The financial system would have gone into meltdown. What the problem was is the regulator wasn't doing their job. The other thing I would say is you think mutualisation is the solution. Well, Co-op is a mutual. Its bank was effectively bust, and its CEO was so rubbish it didn't even notice it was bust. It had to try to buy Lloyd's banks. So that is not the solution. I think the point you made about regulation, it's no longer democratic because it's coming from the EU, is really interesting, because green taxes, if you think the increase in energy bills so far has been big, I was looking at a piece which is about 37% over the last 6 years. I was looking at a piece of research that suggested because of green taxes, which, by the way, Ed Miliband put in when he was energy minister from 2008 and 2010, and was supported by all the political classes, every political party, those green taxes that are coming in will see your energy bills rise approximately by 50% in the next six years. Strangely enough, that's not what the political class tell you. And actually, The Sun is starting a campaign today. I don't know if you read the Saturday Sun, but I do. And they're starting a campaign to get rid of the green taxes in order that your energy bills don't go up 50%. Anyway. One more. Oh, yeah, the idea about that we socialise, we nationalise the train companies and subsidise them. All I would say to that is, what do you do with somebody in the stockbroker belt earning £150,000 a year who pays £8,000 a year for their season ticket? Their season ticket goes down to £1,000 a year, subsidised by all the OAPs trying to live on small amounts of money. It's just a thought.
Andrew, you again don't need to take up anything because just keep the conversation going.
I just wanted to, I think, comment more generally on a number of the contributions were on the sort of theme of. And it was articulated down here. What should the market look like, and how should it operate? And I think we need to be careful about being very idealistic about the way in which markets operate. I mean, the whole purpose of having a market is not to predetermine the outcome of what that market should be. And actually, when we talk about there's 6 big energy companies or there's not enough banks or so on, the efficiency of markets is not generally measured by the number of players unless it gets particularly small. You can think of many international markets which are fiercely competitive, like the car industry, where there's a tendency to move towards a small number of players. And if you read an economic textbook on the sort of market system, you'll get in chapter 1 the description of perfect competition, which is a sort of very idealized view of the market. But most markets are imperfect because the environment in which they work in is imperfect, and we have to live with that. There are examples where the sort of competition gets sufficiently stifled that the market doesn't work properly, and then we have institutions like the Competition Commission, the Office of Fair Trading, which are now being combined to deal with that. And if people don't like what the energy market is doing, they should refer it to the Competition Commission, and they should refer the banking system. We've already had a banking inquiry. We have looked a lot at these markets, and sometimes the uncomfortable fact is that some of the forces, whether it's green levies or whether it's the fact that the price of gas is going up worldwide, some of the forces driving the way these markets are operating are things that we can't properly control ourselves, and we have to adjust to and live with. I just want to come back to this issue about where should we try and extend market forces or activities, where in perhaps where they're not operating properly. And I think the planning system in the UK is something that's been discussed a lot in terms of the way it can inhibit the development of various forms of activity, whether it's development of airports or development of new businesses. And we do have to look quite seriously at the balance that we strike. If we want a well-functioning economy that delivers a high standard of living, we can't constrain that economy too much with various forms of regulation. We've got to make sure that the regulations are efficient. And I'm personally, I'm very disappointed that we've made the airport system more competitive. In the London system, all the airports are now owned by separate entities. But we still can't seem to develop any new capacity because of the way the policy regime and the planning regime operates. So I suppose that the underlying theme is, if the market's not working in the way that you would like, don't necessarily assume that the market is wrong or the market mechanism is wrong. It may be that the factors that are constraining that market are the things that are at fault here.
Okay, thanks. And Phil, you?
Yeah, just on the question of where could the state get out of the way, I just want to dwell on my key point that you cannot discuss the state and the market as being as being opposites. That there is this, touching faith in this sort of pristine free market which could do good things. It just doesn't exist. My main focus today is to stress how bad the state is being and how problematic the state is. But let's be clear that the market has not been working for a very, very long time. The market has got 2 big problems, one quite historic and one more recent. The historic problem is that it's no longer able to consistently develop productivity. There was a time whenever the market, never free capitalism, because I say that was more of an idealized phase rather than a real phase, but there was an ability for the market to be able to move society forward. Living standards increased 4 or 5-fold in most of the developed market economies over the period from the late 19th to the late 20th century. Life expectancy grew enormously. It developed, it innovated, it created lots of things which have seen huge social progress. But it is not able to do that anymore. it is not able to do that consistently anymore. The market was what led us into the world, the Western world, into the slump of the 1930s. The market was what led us into the conflicts of the 1930s, which culminated in war. It was the market which led us into the renewed slowdown in the 1970s. The market failed in those things. The new thing where the market is even more decrepit now, and which the counterposition of the state to market is misleading, is that the market has become itself completely dependent. It has accepted a corporate dependency. Now, certainly you'll have individual business people who I mix with and we all mix with here, who will react and reject particular forms of regulation and state interference. That's an instinctive reaction, and that's a good reaction to have. But day in and day out, the market, business, is accepting as its way of life that regulation is the way things are. Look at something like the corporate governance movement. Right? Corporate governance barely existed before the 1990s. The idea that there can be the need for rules and prescriptions as to how businesses operate. And over the course of 10 years, from the early 1990s through to the early 2000s, it became an accepted fact that businesses should be regulated by corporate governance guidelines. It became an accepted part. Similarly, more and more areas of employment legislation, more and more areas of employment legislation, more and more areas of health and safety regulation where businesses have actually accepted that dependent position. What I want to finish on is there's an underestimation of just how far that corporate dependency has gone. Look at Britain. There are no sectors of the British market economy which are free from state support. You know, the crown of British capitalism, the pharmaceutical industry, is hugely dependent on state money propping it up in terms of the purchasing of drugs and in terms of the way that where it gets its revenues from. The IT industry, which is another seen as a positive, progressive or effective part of the economy, I'm part of that, hugely dependent on government spending in order to be able to continue. Look at the telecoms industry as well. There's not an area that anyone can say actually is not living off and surviving off the state. So let's put to bed this idea that there is this free market waiting, this lion waiting to escape and solve all our problems.
Okay, Thomas?
Right, yeah. Yeah, well, my take on this is, and on several questions, is to do with, I mentioned values, but it's also to do with trust. And I think trust has something to do with scale. It's very hard for us human beings to genuinely trust in very abstract entities. And it's almost a miracle, you know, that we continue to trust in the value of money. And let's just hope that this lasts for a little while still, because you remember what happened in Germany, you know, in the interwar years, and what happened in Zimbabwe a bit later. So, but it's almost a miracle, but we continue to trust money. So your baker, you know, you trust the quality of his bread, maybe because you know him, maybe because you've shopped there before. It's small scale, far more than you trust the government, which is aloof and often arrogant. And it depending on which country you live in, it can be corrupt, you know. It's alienating, and it's faceless, and etc., because it's abstract. And in one of the places where I've done anthropological fieldwork, there was a general spirit of trust towards local capitalists, because they had to be locally accountable, you see. Their children had to go to school with other children. They had to live there. So they had to make peace with the trade unions, and they had to treat workers decently and not lie too much, you know, in their adverts and so on. Whereas the large multinational companies were far less trusted, and often with good reason, because they could just pull out and move their operation to Venezuela if the Trinidadian workers went on strike. So there is something here about scale which connects with trust. And I think we need a third concept. I mean, market and state may not be the right way of phrasing the opposition. I think some of us at least agree on that we're really talking about underlying values. The opposition, okay, between say competition and cooperation, or between utility and sociality, whichever way you want to phrase it, you find that in every kind of institution, and it's really part and parcel. That opposition is part and parcel of all social life. So instead of talking about state and market, maybe we should think about society as a third and as a key element here. That you need the society to play a role as the foundation of a human life, and the state and market are merely props that are required to uphold the values of society.
Okay.
Just posing a question really about timing, and there's lots of things coming from this. If you allow companies to be fully controlled by shareholders, but then also allow them to be controlled by quarterly returns rather than the long-term objective, then companies cease to become trustworthy in the sense of their ideals and services and products that we're trying to do, but just become money-making machines for shareholders. That I understand, you know, that it's great to have this capitalist market, and I'm all for it, but it's just the way that mechanism works, that timescale is not really adhesive to the long-term timescale of getting the country as a whole forward, because that takes a long time.
Okay.
Like everybody else here today, I came looking for some answers. I don't expect anybody to give me a complete economic platform of where we're going to go. But really, could anybody on the platform give us an idea of whether their ideology is better than the others? We seem to have Louise, I think, and Andrew, if you like, are the pro-capitalists. But I'm a bit confused in what you're offering us, basically. I mean, to me, I think Andrew said that the problem with capitalism is not capitalism per se, it's factors constraining its model. Now, to me, I don't know what more you want to try and convince us that capitalism can work. You've got the leg up of the state where you've got 40% of the economy is run by the state in favour of capitalists. There's a mountain of money available on account books throughout the capitalist world. Phil's talked about capitalisation where you're getting complete support wherever you need it financially. You've got, let's be frank, you've got a completely servile working class workforce available to you. You have no opposition, and yet you still can't make the world tick over for the benefiters. So I'm afraid I think you've had your day, you've had your chance. I'm sorry, but you can't convince me.
But is the problem really not zombie states, but rather zombie banks in the UK, in the sense that most of the banks are insolvent? And would it be a good idea for governments to force banks to publish what debts they're holding off their balance sheet, so it could be out in the open, and therefore more lending can then take place to the SMEs, which would promote economic growth?
I want to take strong exception to this view put forward here by the woman in the hat, sorry, I don't know your name, but also very common in economic discussion, which is that the problem is that politicians have a really short-term time horizon. They're only elected for 4 or 5 years. What we need is a longer time horizon. And I take exception to that for 2 reasons. First of all, because it's fundamentally undemocratic, because the implication very clearly is let's leave the economy to clever technocrats, let's not have democratically elected politicians playing a key role. But I also take exception to it because I think it's completely wrong. It's an upside down. Because in my view, the problem is precisely that economic discussion is completely technocratic. It's a very narrow discussion about interest rates. How do we tweak this? How do we tweak that? How do we keep this going? How do we keep that going? There isn't a broader discussion about how to transform the economy, how to make it grow much faster, and how to move away from what Andrew Sentence called the new normal, not let the new normal be acceptable.
I really liked Thomas's introduction about the relationship of moral philosophy and economic philosophy. But it does strike me in this discussion that when Andrew was talking, he was talking about that we had from 1982 to 2007, we need to scale down our excessive expectations. This is someone who says he's pro-market. And then Thomas went on to say that he thinks there's a contradiction between growth and sustainability, and that informs it. And it makes me go to the question that when Phil talks about that there needs to be some control taken, both within the state and potentially within the market, surely that's where the issue lies. We've become very scared about talking about unfettered growth, development, progress, leadership, it seems to me. That is also part of our concern about trust with people. Mm-hmm. And maybe, and I'm interested to hear what the panel thinks about this, rather than trying to make a dichotomy between the state and capitalism and one of those old-fashioned ways. Obviously, make observations empirically, things like the public-private partnership, how the state now pays more money than it did before. But perhaps we should have more abstract discussions about the need for unfettered growth and development and progress in terms of investment and also in terms of our confidence of taking control in both spheres.
Well, having just finished a history degree at Sussex University, I've had my fair share of the history of the welfare state over the last 3 years. And one thing that I noticed in particular is with regard to the more state control that Attlee's government brought in after 1945, is that it did not get off, contrary to how we tend to remember it, to the best of starts. It actually struggled quite intensely in the first few years, and again in the 1970s. And in both cases where it kind of ran into problems with just purely financial matters, I mean, Nia Bevan very honestly said that he figured out the NHS by stuffing the doctors' mouths with gold. And in both cases, the way that they resolved it, in the case of British Rail, was when they actually got in some directors and sort of contractors from the most successful private companies as advisors. And similarly, in the 1980s, I've got a friend who works quite high up in Balfour Beatty who thinks that the railways were at their best in the just pre-privatisation day when British Rails was publicly owned but run like a private business. I just wonder if, as Louise kind of pointed out about the, and I guess Phil said the symbiosis, if it's sort of similar to Gramsci's idea of like hegemony between public and private, whether there is something in that, because I think we can both agree that both ideas, when left on their own, run into quite a few problems, especially when they either alone can actually work at all.
Yes, I guess conceptually at least, the state is the mechanism by which you take collective action. And the market is the mechanism by which you take selfish action. So to the extent that you have the same constituency, you can, as a society, have a debate. And you can say, well, we think for reasons of philosophical freedom, you should be able to behave selfishly in a certain context. Or we think for reasons of optimal production in society, you should be able to behave selfishly. And we can find the sort of synthesis between those two. But we don't appear to have perfect alignment between constituencies, because the state is not the free market. So when we complain about whether Starbucks pays tax or how Google behaves, we don't have dominion over Starbucks or Google. So I think at least in part, what we hear from the politicians is there is no alternative. This is dictated. We can do nothing about it. We've heard it from both main parties in the last few weeks.
So my point kind of centres around the ways of propping up and kind of increasing the workability of capitalism. And then we haven't had any mention of kind of an international market. So I'm just wondering whether the panel agrees with me in thinking that reducing barriers to trade, increasing globalisation, really creates an interdependent economy on a more international scale. So if you look at the really strong periods of growth in history, you had the globalisation from the 90s through to 2008, and then you had the imperialist trade, which a long time ago, but that increased economic growth hugely. So I was just wondering what the panel thought about a more interdependent global economy instead of regulation, actually reducing regulation internationally to support domestic capitalism.
Hello. I wonder what the panel would think about deferred payment bonuses for politicians based on, for the health minister, lifetime expectancy. And my second other thought would be, how would the panel consider regulating for increased competition?
I wanted to ask Thomas if he can expand more about the society as a key element, because it struck me really as amazing that we are speaking about state and the market in really abstract terms, and nobody speaks about the people. And what is in, and we also speak about growth, and even though we are aware that most of our needs are commodified and everything, or our relations are commodified to the extent that we don't even, I mean, and we want more market to commodify even more, and why do we need growth, indeed? I mean, in that sense.
I'm going to ask the panel to come back in just with one or two sentences, a closing thought, the one thing that they want you to remember. Andrew, why don't you kick us off?
I was just going to pick up on this theme of internationalisation, because I was going to mention this anyway. I think when we talk about the marketplace now, it is a very international marketplace in many aspects of life. And actually that has delivered very big benefits for particularly economies that are trying to develop and emerge from low standards of living in China and India by integrating into the market. It did actually deliver quite a lot of benefits for the West up until the mid-2000s, when we benefited from buying lots of cheap stuff from China and other low-cost economies. That's flipped round now, because the very strong growth in the Asia-Pacific region, the emerging world, is now pushing up the cost of stuff we buy, like energy, commodities and food, and that's turning into a squeeze. But I do agree with the general proposition that we haven't quite cracked the whole issue of managing this very complex and all-embracing global marketplace. 94% of the world's population now lives in an economy which is a member of the World Trade Organization. That is a degree of access to the world economy we have not seen in the whole history of the world economy. And it brings great benefits, but it also brings potential instability. And looking forward, of course, more international cooperation on the way in which the financial system and the trading system is operated would be a benefit, but that's hard to achieve. I do actually think, though, however, that if we're looking for something to improve growth and productivity that Phil's talking about, I don't think it's the government can drive productivity, but opening up markets further, going the opposite way to the way that we went in the 1930s, which was towards more protectionism, trying to liberalise markets further internationally is probably the way to go.
Maybe I could start where you ended. I mean, with the globalised economy, because there you clearly see the inconsistency in free market ideology. Because as Joe Stiglitz wrote some years ago, well, in the United States we're all for a free, sort of unfettered world economy, but we're against imports. You see, so you want to protect your own. And if you take the principle of comparative advantage to its extreme, it turns out that in the end, at the end of the day, nothing will be profitable anywhere, except perhaps in China or India, because you have unlimited supply of cheap labor. So it will no longer be meaningful, to produce anything at all in Britain, because it's too expensive. Not to mention Norway, where we're already in serious trouble. But I'd like to pick up on the last question. Yes, I mean, we need a discussion about values, because it's quite clear that the kind of vision you have for the future depends very much on what values are at the foundation of your thinking. And when it comes to the long and the short term and the large and the small scale, which are things that I am preoccupied with when I look at economics, it's quite clear that if you have a human science without people, there must be something missing. Okay, there must be something missing if the people are not there. And this is the case not just for economics. I mean, a lot of economics which is very much based on models which are often proved wrong, at the end, but also some other human sciences. And this is why I think the concept, the notion of society as being based on relationships between human beings, concrete human beings, okay, and their lives and their struggles and their existential qualms and their doubts and the projects and their hopes and so on, that has to be at the base of any sensible discussion about state and market, where you discover that state and market may vicariously, they may be the enemies of people, and they may sometimes pull in the right direction, and they sometimes represent the same kind of principle as in new public management, where the state pretends to be market-driven, or in a very moral market economy, where there is accountability and we can actually trust, and so on and so forth.
Perfect.
I like to pick up on the zombie banks question and the help to buy scheme. Most people think it's as the press have called it, the casino banking that's the dangerous bit, the investment bank. But actually, property is a massively dangerous business, far more so, has the capacity to do far more damage to the banking industry than any derivatives trader. I think, and I know Andrew would know the number better than I do, but I think there's £1 trillion worth of mortgage loans in this country. I think that's the number. A 20% fall in property prices destroys most banks, or even a 10% fall in property prices, if people were actually to renege on those loans. So I think there is a problem, and I wonder, if I have a really sceptical hat on, if the government has come up with its Help to Buy scheme, to help ordinary people, but also to save the banks and to stimulate the market so the banks aren't bust. That's if I was being really sceptical. The only other thing I would say is I actually think the UK economy is going to start booming, which is quite a controversial view.
Well, we can only hope. You heard it here, or maybe you didn't. Phil.
Well, that's opened up a big one, yeah. I mean, that's the, unfortunately, I think it's the underestimate of how deep our problems are. I think, it's great if a few people are buying a few more things, but when you consider, what's happening at levels of employment and productivity and business investment and all those other things, we're by no means out of the woods, as they say. Is there a way out of this? Well, Andrew's saying he questions whether my inclination that the state could do something to drive productivity is feasible. What I am absolutely sure about is if the Western state carries on the way it is at the moment, there will not be any possibility of getting productivity growth. Because what the state is doing in its, somebody challenged me and said I was underestimating the ideological drive and the political drive of the state. I see things absolutely the opposite. You know, there is no political interest, ideological interest driving the state. Its resort to pragmatic, short-term, non-ideological muddling through is what is creating the biggest problem at the moment, because I think it does mean that we are evading how deep the problems are at the level of production. So if the state carries on doing what it's doing, pumping money into the economy as if, you know, that's going to somehow, you know, stimulate production again, but it doesn't. It just thinks it might stimulate a bit of consumption. If it continues to prop up what is already categorically broken, then it will not be possible to create any basis for renewal. So the state has to stop what it's doing at the moment in order to at least open up a proper political discussion, to echo what some other people have said, about the importance of growth, about the importance of productivity, about the importance of development, and show some bloody black backbone and some political leadership to get that debate going. In terms of policies, I think there are many that we could discuss. Policies, I sum them up in the 3 I's, policies of state policies for investing in infrastructure, for supporting business investment, and state policies for innovation. The reality is the state has done some amazing things in the past in other circumstances. You might not like the circumstances that surrounded them, but it did, you know, do the Manhattan Project in, what, 3 years. It did get man to the moon. It did create something which we use all the time, this internet thingy, again, driven by the Cold War, but the state, when it puts its mind to something and has a mission and a sense of purpose, can do great things. It's going to need a huge revolution in political perspective to bring that about, but I don't see any other way to at least clear the road and begin to get that discussion going.